Good morning, everyone. Good morning to another beautiful and interesting conversation, this time about storytelling. And I'm really thrilled about the fact that we have David with us. And Vlad, I know for sure that you are really looking forward to this talk, especially because we kind of like know David for a couple of a lot more months than you could say. And we know what great of a storyteller he is and how beautiful stories he can write and design. So David is our guest today. More than just being our guest, he is one of people or the persons that are committed to developing Africa, and that's one story that he can tell more about it. And he has a true passion about the African continent and about making the African continent to become the power that it can be, and developed all of that potential in there. Know for sure that you're working with a lot of leaders within the African continent to enable them to grow. I know for sure that you are also the new president of ICF Kenya. And that's another like giving back to the profession of coaching again. Your story, it's an impressive story also from this world of banking, and kind of like can resonate to that from moving to the banking. And I think Adina can also the same thing say, she can resonate to this change from the corporate environment to coaching, and how coaching can have an impact on the lives around us. And so with a really, really great pleasure to talk about storytelling with you. David, what kind of story do you want to share from the beginning?
Very good. And thanks, Christina, for having me, and Vlad. And it's good to be with you on this forum, Coaching and Mentoring Festival. As you say, stories is a way of life. Life is actually a story. Beginning to the end, we have a beginning, we are born, we live hopefully a decent life, a middle of a story, and then we exit the stage, the ending of a story. Between the beginning and the end, we are different players in that story. We are either actors, either being acted upon by the story, either engineers of the story, of craftsmen of the story, architects of the story. And that's where coaching comes in, that we help our clients be able to tell a story. Now, storytelling without a story is not a good thing. So I'll tell a story, and Vlad and Christina know the sort of stories I tell. So I want to tell a story, a short story, about some life in a village somewhere, some deep remote village somewhere, where long time ago, many decades ago, the story received a visitor one evening. And the visitor was from a very distant land. And the visitor found the people doing what they do best, sitting around a fire telling stories. And as the visitor came, this community welcomed the visitor in their usual generosity, in their usual being welcoming to visitors. They welcomed the visitor amongst them. And the visitor liked the place. And he started assimilating into their way of life. He even started knowing how to tell their own stories. And before long, everybody was happy. The visitor was happy. He was well settled. And the visitor from the distant land actually started inviting other visitors from his land to come and settle here. And the villagers were liking him. They were assimilating him. They were even elevating him to positions of leadership together with these people, and everybody was happy. But the visitor started getting a little crafty, and he started taking his leadership a little too far. He actually started getting the people to serve him as opposed to him just being part of the community. He elevated his position within the community. And you can guess what happened. The community started feeling, we welcomed you, but now you are not being very nice. We need to have a conversations amongst ourselves. They also realized that because the visitor was now the one telling the stories, he was influencing their story the way he wanted the story to be. So they realized their stories were mutating. Where the characters were heroes, the characters were now starting to be defeated. So the villagers retreated to the forest and they said, now what are we going to do? And they said, well, the visitor seems to have some superior power over us. He actually has strong ammunitions. We can't fight him. He's got some magical things which he fires and they kill people. So we only have crude weapons. And one wise old visitor said, but you know what? There's something we have that the visitor doesn't have. He said, what's that? Our gods resides in this forest where we are in, so we can have a conversation with them and ask them, how do we deal with this visitor who has actually now started working on us instead of being a good visitor, a good friend? So they consulted their gods, and the gods said, you know what? I'm going to grant you a request. You need to go and fight hard. I'll give you conditions. You have to fight at night, in the middle of the night, and you'll chase the visitor. And they did as they were told. They went at night, they fought the visitor, they caught him by surprise, and they chased the visitor out of the village. And the village lived happily thereafter. That's the end of my story, Christina.
And I also know from you that a story never ends. A story continues with any new storyteller.
Absolutely. And that story can be picked from anywhere. And the new storyteller can pick it and continue from that point. Now, what I also say from the story is that a story can be used to get into very sensitive topics, and coaching, gets into very sensitive and vulnerable topics. Same with a story. Like I've just dealt with a very sensitive topic of colonization, because that's exactly what that story is about. And within that story, depending on who is telling the story, and with coaching, you want your client to be the person telling their own story, then they know how they are going to, you want to empower them with the ability to tell their own stories. If it's within a corporate space, the middle manager needs to know how to tell his own story to an interview panel. He needs to know how to tell his own story to suppliers of a certain product. Whatever the space is, they need to have that courage to be able to tell their own stories, and also to influence the story the way it emerges now and into the future. Because in coaching, you want to focus more into the future. How are they going to craft their own story into the future? Now, within the African continent, we have one gift of being storytellers. So how do we empower the African person, African leader, to be able to tell his story in a confident way, in an articulative way, in a way that fits within the modern corporate space? So we take the best from both worlds.
It is very
That's a powerful story there. Vlad, please, you want to say something?
Yeah, actually, what David told us inspired me to think about what we as individuals are ready and willing to listen and discover when it's come about stories. Also about the story we are telling, the story we are knowing, but we are not telling. And also, what are the stories that are coming with us from the past and we are not aware about them? And somehow I do think coaching and mentoring are processes that could help us to increase this awareness in a systemic way.
Absolutely.
And I'm glad that we also have Adina together with us. And I know that because she travel around and she's Romanian and roots, English as a location now, and international as the soul, if I am allowed to say like this. And I know that David also travel a lot, and he is not a native English speaker. And I would like to move the discussion at this level. How easy is to go further with the storytelling, with metaphors, and with accurate narrative when you are speaking in a non-native language. And I know that English is not my strength. Foreign languages are not my strength. For sure, I am a great listener, no matter the language. But I would like to know David experience around this, and maybe I don't know, Adina, Doris, Christina also, who is trilingual, could share about how is storytelling in not your mother tongue.
Can I just make one quick observation, because you brought to mind a coaching situation. I speak several languages and I adore language as an instrument. So I always like languages, and that's how it is, including the Romanian language, which is exquisite. And so I remember a coaching situation where it's rare, but it happened. I had a client who was equally multilingual. And we ended up speaking using 3 or 4 languages in the same sentence, literally, because the way we mapped the nuances and of what we tried to express simply did not fit the English, which was the practice language at the time. This was happening in London. This lady was Dutch, and you know, Dutch have got this wonderful ability to speak languages. Everyone speaks at least 2 or 3 languages. Every person in Holland speaks 3 languages. It's amazing. And so we ended up using English, French, German in the same sentence. And it was wonderful because no one even blinked. We just started to put words in. And all I'm trying to say is that on the one hand, it does stress you in the beginning, because you need to have a complex system of correlating and relating the content to the format of language. But if you have more available as instruments, then you can pick and choose the closest expression of the nuance, and that it's delightful, I have to say.
Thank you, Adina. What about you, David?
Thank you, Vlad, for that thought. And I'll just add to what Adina said in terms of the context. What I've found my own practical experience as I engage with clients across the African continent, because the African continent, there are many countries, and each of them have different contexts. The local narratives are different. If I'm coaching a client from Ghana, the experience is very different from when I'm coaching a client in Malawi. The metaphors that will resonate on the western side of Africa will be very different from the metaphors that will resonate with the southern side or the eastern side. And having that awareness as a coach, as a mentor, becomes very important, because you may be assuming a context. And what I practically do is, during the initial times that I'm setting my chemistry with the client, we get into a lot of storytelling about our context, so that I get to understand the context. If it's a new, like I'm getting into a relationship now with a client from Ethiopia, for example, I will talk stories about Ethiopia, a bit of the past, a bit of what is happening now, and we invest a bit of time just to understand that. Luckily, as I said, in Africa, telling stories is not something we struggle with. And because we had the same, we had a lot of the markets I'll be serving, the international languages, I only speak English. The others are local languages. I speak 3 languages as well, but the only international one I speak is English. So I'll do my coaching in former British colonies across Africa. I've got a lot of interest, say, in a country where one country where there's a lot of, it's a French speaking, but I can't coach using a translator. So I know that's lost opportunity, but I have to understand the context so that even as they share metaphors, I don't get lost. As we share stories, I don't get lost. So Vlad, very, very true that the context is very, very valid. Allow me, Christina, to acknowledge. I see Doris, I see Violet. These are also coaches from Kenya. I recognize the names, and it's good to have you, Doris and Violet, on the call.
That's so lovely, and I thank you very much for both of you for taking the time. And if you have any questions or any thoughts that you want to share, more than happy to include them. See there, Violet, thank you very much. There's one thing that when you were talking made me think of. Indeed, there's a lot of stories that we bring in the coaching relationship, and there's a lot of stories that are around the client, are around us, are around the relation that is being built. And I think I would find it useful to explore also a bit of how do we sometimes rewrite these narratives.
Very, very good question. And before we started, we were having a conversation. We've just come from a Made in Africa Leadership Conference. And one of the big things we are talking about in the conference is exactly that. How do we, if we take Africa as a unit with a story that is crafted so much with a different influence, how do we rewrite that narrative? For clients, how do we, especially now the client within that context? A lot of the clients I find, I deal with a lot of self-confidence as a general area of interest. And you can almost bet where that comes from. It's a long history of socialization in a particular way. So rewriting their own stories becomes a very important part of the conversation. How do you get them to be conscious that their story could actually be different, that they could actually be crafters and engineers and architects of their own story, so that it's not told by somebody else, especially in a boardroom where they are not. Mm-hmm. They need to be the creators of their own story. So that's a very valid point, that rewriting their story is part of our job as coaches and mentors, to help people rewrite their stories in a way they would want them to be.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those thoughts there. And I'm wondering now, going even further, because I do recall when we had a conversation about things that we have but we're not aware of, and all of the things around that topic. And, I'm wondering now, how is it when we're trying to become aware of the fact that we do have stories around us? And how much are we aware of those stories? And in the relation with a coach, how can we support us as a coach of our clients to become aware of those stories that they have with walking with them? And
yeah, can I just add, because this is very, very interesting to what David says, a little nuance, David. So there are so many exceptional heroes in the African story. Well, Mandela is such a cliche, but he's so, I mean, my mind, I still can't comprehend the resilience of that person, but it's one example of many. So how do you, or could you introduce the heroes that exist, which are local heroes, in the narrative of building up the confidence of the people you work with? And that matches a little bit with Christina. In other words, there are our story, but the stories around us and the heroes that people can identify with. Where do they come into your facilitation of this ownership of a history of heroes, not only just hardship?
Yes, a very, very good observation there, Dina. And thanks to Christina and Vlad for their challenge to me earlier on in our initial conversations. There are many initiatives. There are actually pockets of initiatives that are speaking to exactly that a critical mass of the African well-informed and traveled people acknowledge that there's something that needs to happen to exactly address that point. These stories need to be known, first of all, by the Africans themselves, but also by the people who are friends of Africa as well. And one of the tools that we are using, which is what had brought this conference together, we have an initiative as a Breakfast Club Africa, where we challenge ourselves to get a critical mass of leaders who think differently, who lead differently, and who are driven by a different motive than the bulk of the people who have been fed with that narrative that is negative. How do we start reshaping the African narrative story? Christina knows that I was writing a book, but after our conversations, it changed completely because it now started talking to exactly that. Reshaping the African narrative in a subtle way that you are not taking tools. This week we celebrated the Day of the African Child, which was actually a very brutal day on 16th of November, 1976, when African kids decided that enough is enough. In South Africa, apartheid is not working, you're not educating as well, and they marched. And obviously the police came out with the full force and shot quite a number of them. But you know what, that flipped and it changed the South Africa to what we have today, where people have their freedoms, where people can be themselves. Now, where we are today, we don't need that sort of military work, but we need a mindset that is able to shift things that way. We need a critical mass of people speaking that way. Yesterday, we launched an initiative, no, the day before, Make Africa Work for Africans. And that is bringing now an element of the leadership that we've been ignoring, the public sector leaders, because that's where policies are made. We've focused a lot on the private sector, but we are saying we need some African leaders who think differently, and we need the public sector to come in. So the Make Africa Work for Africans is an initiative that talks to that. How do we get the public sector to actually start changing policies? How do we get people in national leadership to speak the language of leadership? And one of the panelists in our conversation this week was the vice president of one of the countries where the country is shifting and saying, you know what, we can lead ourselves differently. And we can take action that starts talking a positive Africa. And we've got a few that have made that decision at the top level. So we are saying we can have a critical mass of leaders who think that way and they can influence that way. And then we reach out to friends of Africa who see Africa not as just a place where you come in to take resources, but where you can actually have a win-win for everybody, because Africa is rich in resources, lots of them, lots of talent, but it also needs to benefit the owner of the resources. So that's the sort of thinking that we are doing. We realize we have not been collaborating as people who think that way, but there's opportunity to collaborate more and be wise around it and how we get the story of Africa to be able to benefit the world to the level it should.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in my mind, you know, there is this paradox. In my mind, Africa, I haven't looked at the numbers, but arguably, I think Africa is the richest continent on the planet, and it's got the youngest population. So quite frankly, I remain baffled at the fact that such a fabulous, unique resource is not flipped into yielding for the population. And I was also thinking, going back a little bit in time, about this Pan-African movement that Sedat Senghor, I believe, led. There is such a rich local culture that is being lost because there is all this import of westernized sort of practices. Whereas if you look at what, in fact, Africa culturally has exported, the entire music of America, because European music is a little bit different, is basically African-based. If you look at the modern dance and modern movement is based on African native dances, if you look at that. So I'm thinking, you know, this continent could be an absolute. On the other hand, I'm also thinking that probably there is a need of adapting the local dynamics, the local leadership, the local practices, and not just import models like parliaments and democracies and all of that stuff, which may not work in the local culture, and create a hybrid of governance, state governance, which actually takes into account the local culture and practices, because you have this overlay of, we have a president and we have elections and the parliament, but beneath the scenes, the power the power vectors are not at all working along those lines. They are working along communities. So just to say that I'm really looking forward to Africa yielding and converting this enormous asset, which is both geographic but also population-wise. It's a very young continent with young population, and just I want to see it rocket into exceptional achievements.
I absolutely spot on, and the opportunity is there. There is much more conscious, deliberate effort now towards that. And you are right, in terms of resources, it's the richest, but unfortunately also houses among the poorest communities in the world.
Exactly. That's the paradox. That is absolutely the paradox, which is incomprehensible in terms of conversion of resource into well-being and quality of life. That's the paradox, yeah.
Absolutely.
You know what comes now naturally into the conversation, because we kept on talking about the individual stories and individual narratives, but it now moves into the conversation around collective narrative and what is the narrative that the entire community experiences, or now expanding to the continent. And I'm wondering, also making sure that I'm mindful of the time on everyone's side, of how is now the story that you started at the beginning with that collective narrative, because at the end it was about a community. How is now that story? How do you perceive that story is going on now?
That's actually the work we are doing within Breakfast Club Africa, plus other initiatives that different pockets have started, where we now start the communities getting aware that they need to, first of all, know their own narrative, then craft their own narrative as a community. And that community could be even within the business enterprises they set up. If you set up an indigenous enterprise, how do you at that community shape your own life and your own destiny and your own ambitions and growth beyond just the local community, but grow it to a national company, to a Pan-African company, to a global company? So scale up your narrative from your own source. Same with communities. How do you feel challenged? Exactly what Adina said, that we have all these resources, but we are also housing the poorest communities. How do you actively challenge and wisely, and I use the word wisely here deliberately, challenge your national leadership in a way that you change that narrative? Because if you challenge it unwisely, you might find yourself not on this side of the world, but admiring the world from the other side, wherever people go. And that's a reality that happens in Africa. So you have to wisely know, how do I challenge this status quo in a way that we can change the fortunes of the masses that are desperately living in poverty.
I'm wondering also now if you would be willing to share a glimpse into that story that will be told in 20 years from now.
I'll share because it's in the public domain, one of the countries in Africa, Malawi. And we had, as I said, the vice president in that conversation, and we asked him, what's your dream for the community story in Malawi? And their vision is, we want to make the Malawian person happy. Now, a desperate, poverty-stricken person is unlikely to be happy. So if you start on that dream of making the Malawian happy, and say within the next 10 years, we want the average Malawian to be happy. Not very far from here, 2 countries away, Rwanda, the president has said, I want to make Rwanda the Singapore of Africa. So and he doesn't have to recreate, to reinvent the wheel. He just takes what did Lee Kuan Yew do with Singapore in the 1960s, and he's doing exactly the same, picking a backward economy which was on the brink of collapse to make it a modern economy. So 20 years from now, it's an Africa that is confident, it's an Africa that is taking its space within the global space to be able to be driving positivity across the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now, obviously, I'm now curious to go one step further and say that's how the narrative should be, and what are the implications at the level of action and also at the level of how you would perceive the identity of the African continent later on. Just curious, what are your thoughts on this one? So how
Sorry,
it's
I missed the question, Christina.
So I was wondering now how if you take this further, this image of how it would be in the African continent of these countries in 20 years from now, and moving now to the level of let's call it landscape of identity of the African continent, what kind of identity with what kind of identity would the African continent would be associated with?
I'm not sure, Christina, I fully understand the question. Maybe these are question of language now. Maybe this is what is in my mind, and maybe now you are speaking in Romanian, I'm thinking in Kiswahili.
Ooh, then I would be curious if you want to share how that sounds in that language, because I think we don't have the chance to hear those beautiful languages.
Yes, but just take that question again so that I fully get the gist of the question.
I'm wondering what is the impact of that narrative on the future identity of the African continent? Will that be still the same stories that have been told 20 years ago, or those stories and those narratives and those identities going to shift towards something else?
I think, let me answer it this way. Stories are dynamic. And what might happen in 20 years from now, the persons who are actually now driving the shaping of those stories are likely to be now the heroes in those stories that will be told 20 years from now. In terms of the stages in life where we were 20 years ago, whereas today we speak about, like the story I told about the visitor coming, the colonialist, we will be talking about now the people who gave life to the new Africa that will be that time. So our stories have a lot of heroes and activities that happened. So 20 years from now, the stories will be talking about the heroes who did what they are doing today, and then the activities that they did. And obviously, in the process, there is normally collateral damage as you try and shape the destiny of a people. So there are some people who in the process will be collateral damage within the process.
Mm-hmm. Well, David, I find it as a great honor that we can say we had, I'm assuming, one of the heroes of those stories that are going to be told in the future, because we know that you are a big driver for this decision, for these initiatives around creating the leadership of tomorrow in Africa, and how all of those changes can be supported also by coaching and mentoring and a shaping of stories via coaching and mentoring. And so I believe that we have a way of saying, in 20 years from now, we're gonna have a conversation with the hero of those stories and see what how is that narrative now, and what is the story that you're gonna tell us in 20 years from now. So
thank you. I hope we will be kept alive that long, and we will maintain our relationships. In our gray-haired wisdom, we'll revisit the conversation 20 years from today. I'll be glad to do that when we are old men and women.
I bet Christina could make an anchor for 20 years from now on to pop up on our calendar. Review the story with David from 20 years ago and see how evolved. I want to take a bit of chance. Maybe Doris or Violet want to add something in voice or in message.
I know Doris and Violet
They
not to
are
be
on
shy
the
people.
finish of the
Hi, David. It's good to see you. And hi, Christina. And hi, Vlad. First, I'll apologize. I joined a little late. I left a previous meeting slightly late. It's a really interesting conversation. And when I saw it online, I had to join it because stories and narratives are really interesting to me as I develop my coaching practice. The question I had, David or Christina or Vlad, is what coaching techniques can we help or can help reauthor the stories and narratives that are no longer beneficial? Because we've been talking about stories and backstories, and some of these are no longer beneficial, but what kind of coaching techniques have you found useful in helping clients reauthor those narratives into alternative ones that perhaps can translate into new behaviors and patterns, which is what are needed? Oh, sorry, I should have put on my video. So,
Right.
Good to see you. Thank you for the question.
Yeah.
It's a very good one.
Thank you, Violet, and thanks for joining. And you are right. Sometimes we get fixated with some nice historical story, and we keep telling it and retelling it, and even long after it has served its purpose. You asked specifically about the tools I use. I'll tell you a very simple thing I do is just acknowledge that there are some stories that are useless and they'll not help you. So as a client, we say we'll have tough conversations. If there is a story about some heroic thing that you did 52 years ago, it may not replicate exactly the same way. It's a nice one, but don't fix yourself too much there. As with coaching, we focus in the future. How do we craft the present and the future so that those stories become that way? So that when we have time, yes, we can relive the past and enjoy those stories, but we just participate in creating our current and future stories, and we focus more effort there. And having the courage to discard the stories that are no longer adding value to us.
Thank you.
I am sure that Christina will have something to add because she's so fan of the narrative. However, I will take the time till she will talk and say that from my point of view, I use some metaphors like if this story it's on one channel on the TV and you'll change the channel, what story will appear on that channels? If he's a person who used to watch TV, if he's a person who like to read books, if you close this book and put on the shelf and take another book, what will be a story that will be better for you? And because I had a very interesting experience with a person who is a fan of cars in a team coaching intervention, for him I will say, okay, if you are going to change the car you have now with a different car that will be better for you, what car will be that? Now it's kind of, and indeed it's hard to stop or change the finish of one story and start another chapter. And it's better to be a chapter from a different story.
Sure.
Thank you both of you for sharing those thoughts. And indeed, I think when it comes to narrative coaching or narrative coming from narrative therapy, there are a lot of useful tools in there, and it's a lot of knowledge, not just experimental, but really based on research on how can we help our clients move to different narratives. How can you play this moving this shift between landscape of action and landscape of identity, and how the two of them are correlating and influencing each other. And I think that's a beautiful conversation to have with any kind of client, because it makes them aware how their actions tell stories about who they are, and who they are tell stories about their actions, and so on. So how do you move through between those landscapes? And I really like, and I find it's powerful to just move into this kind of metaphors of books and chapters, because chapter also has an implication of an end and a new beginning. So I think it depends also on what kind of person you have in front of you as a client, and what kind of things you can bring as a coach, and based on your knowledge and experience. Same time, I think that we should not be drawn into those narratives. We should make sure that as a coach, we also see those narratives with a certain distance, and allow also the client to see those narratives from a distance, so they can take out of there exactly those things that are relevant for them. And I find that sometimes extremely difficult to imagine that resonation. You resonate as a coach to a person, to a story, and it is incredibly difficult to just say, I stay in my state, and I stay into the conversation that I need to continue. And I think that's even more powerful when they're stories, and they're stories like you were telling, David, that's those stories that relate to you deeply, because they relate to the same history. They relate to the same conversations and around things that happened to the same community, to the same country, to the same continent. And so I really do believe that only working together we can change those narratives, especially when we talk about narratives of continents and of huge communities like the ones in Africa. And I find it important to have those conversations, and to continue having those conversations about changing narratives with a greater good, with a greater impact on the entire population. And not about population, but I think it's about those communities. But at the same time, making sure that those heroes of those old stories, like you were saying, David, at the beginning, that small community, when they invited the stranger and the visitor, they invited him with stories that they were about them, about their history, about their past. Make sure that the best out of those stories are being kept. And like I've learned from you every time, is that a good African story never ends. It just shifts and grows with every storyteller.
Absolutely.
So I would, considering the time, I would say thank you so much. And before leaving, I would just invite you to tell us a glimpse into the story that starts now.
The story that starts now is about a team that is just about preparing to go into a match. They've been preparing for the last 12 months, and the match is supposed to be happening within the next month or so. So they're in high gear, they're in high spirits, and we are waiting to see how the game plays and pans out. We are confident they will win. We are giving them the courage to go there and face the opposing team. They've had a few friendly matches they've won, so we are looking forward to the real match. My story ends there, Christina.
That's so beautiful, because the metaphor fits exactly brilliantly with what's going on right now with the European, with the World Championship, and whatever we have around soccer, and all of the joy of having sports back. So thank you so much, David. It was a true pleasure. And as I said, 20 years from now, we want to hear those stories about that hero that sits in front of us now, trying to change the narrative around the African continent.
Thank you, Christina, for having me. Thank you, Vlad. Thank you, Violet and Doris, for joining. And have a great day.
Thank you, all of you. And see you next time. Well and health.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. This was really interesting. Thank you.
Bye.
It's good to see you, David.
Thanks. Good to see you, Violet.
Yeah.